enough to be in preschool, I used a Mommy's Day Out program at a Baptist church in Springfield so that he could get more kids socialization, because he's my only child, and so that I could have an extra morning to work. I don't know what the other mommies were doing, but I was working. So when I picked him up one day, you know, you'd go to the sort of on the edge of the building, and it had its own door. And I went to pick him up. He refused to leave. And he instead toddled. He was just barely walking off down a hallway, like he knew where he was going, deeper into the church facility. It was the lunch hour. There was nobody there. And when he came to a T in the hallway, he confidently turned left and just toddled off down another hallway. And I was doing that, mommy, like, Jay, stop. We're not supposed to be here. You have to stop. And this was a toddler on a mission. So I just followed him down several corridors of this empty church until he pointed at a door, like he owned the place. That was his door. And I opened it, and we were in their sanctuary. And he flung out his arms and he yelled, "Da!" And I just stared at him because I didn't know why we were here. And he went, "Hallelujah." Good pastor's kid, right? Last week, I told you I bought a house in Springfield. I kicked myself for buying. It was a weird house, but here's a big part of the reason I bought it. There were no neighbors across the street. And I had come from a homeowners association, right? There were no neighbors across the street from it. Across the street was the back lot of a big church, a different Baptist church. And there was a huge parking lot, the church, a huge parking lot, and then a massive green space, big, green, well-maintained space across from the house. That was a win. And that lot was empty the vast majority of the time. And the neighbors used it to get through the neighborhood because we didn't have sidewalks. And that's where I taught Jay how to roll down grassy hills. That parking lot is where I taught him to ride his tricycle. The neighbors all used it. We knew it wasn't our property. Still, we helped take care of it. We picked up trash and sticks. We chased people off that were blowing fireworks off because it was right outside the city limit late at night. And a lot of the things that happened on the church property that were problematic, they happened at night when the church was closed, but the neighbors could see, and we would call the police or even go over there ourselves and stop it. It was a space the homeowners in the area enjoyed, and we were gentle and careful with it. As you can imagine, it didn't give us a sense of ownership, but it gave us a sense that we had a relationship with that church through its property. And then one day, during the shutdown, I walked out my front door, and across from my house was a sign that said, "Private property, no trespassing." And there was one in front of my neighbor's house, and there was one in front of her neighbor's house. And I bristled. Jay had just gotten a new bike, and he wanted to learn to ride it in that big, empty, 7 days a week, empty parking lot across from our house because we had a steep driveway. And I bristled as I told him he couldn't do that. I bristled when he asked me what that sign in front of our house said. I bristled as a neighbor who helped care for that space, who made that space better for the church that owned it. And I bristled as a mom who wanted her kid to be safe when he learned to ride a bike. And I bristled as a Jesus-following mom because I want my kid to always associate churches with safe space and welcome. But I also bristled as a pastor who had gone through this same thing with the church I served. Because years before I had gotten there was a minor incident, and the church's response, it might have been slightly overreactive. They put 6-foot tall chain link fence around the side of their property that faced the town, and they covered it with no trespassing signs. It was subtle. It was subtle, right? And that church had constant acts of vandalism. Little country church, little country town, everything but my name got scrambled on that sign almost every week. Our parking lot got torn up. Our landscaping there were all kinds of problems all the time. And I encouraged the trustees to remove the signs, remove the no trespassing signs. And they did not do it until the day we arrived on Sunday to find one of our no trespassing signs stuck on our front door, tied with a chain, and they'd stuck a pole through the door handles of our church so we couldn't open it. I didn't do it. But it made a very clear point of what the neighborhood thought of our signs. So the signs came down, and when it did, we had no more acts of vandalism. And the church property got better because the neighbors started coming in and taking care of it and telling us and calling when they saw something. And 2 years later, at a busy community event, this young man from the town came up to me and said, "Hey, the vandalism around here has stopped." And I said, "Yes, it has." And he said, "I have to make a confession. Every single act of vandalism at that church was done by one kid who saw the no trespassing signs." And he apologized. And he said he'd never do it again. Our signs inspired his vandalism, but taking them down had inspired him to see our church as his church, and he wanted to know if he could give me his prayer concerns. And after living through that as a pastor, I now faced it as one of the neighbors. I was now the person outside the fence, right? It wasn't a real fence. So a neighbor called me over one day, and she asked me, "What do you think about those signs across from all our houses?" I said, "Oh, what do you think about them?" And her family was mad. And they nominated me to deal with it. Because we didn't have a homeowners. I was the homeowners association, right? I was the neighborhood pastor. So I said, okay, I will do my best. So I sent an email. There were multiple drafts in which I explained our concerns. It was a lot of questions. It was questions like, should I explain to my 4-year-old that other churches aren't as welcoming as the one he attends? Or should I simply tell him, you aren't a church anymore, so it won't cloud his view of churches? And then I asked them, what do you think the other children in the neighborhood who also take careful care of your property, but whose parents aren't pastors, what do you think they're talking about and learning about churches in their homes this week? Just have some questions. And I had a follow-up plan developed, but within 24 hours, their children's pastor was at my house, which, okay, acceptable. Church property is something we have responsibility for stewarding. We're stewards of the property. But people believe what they see, right? So we have to be careful not to put signs on our property that say, no trespassing, or do not enter. Have you seen churches that try to steer their traffic by putting do not enter signs? People believe that sign, and they do not enter. right? When a church says no trespassing, either metaphorically or literally, it becomes much more difficult to get our neighbors to trespass here on Sunday morning because they perceive them coming onto our property as a trespass. And it gets really hard to get them to come in here and with us ask God to forgive our trespasses. We ask every week in worship for God to forgive our trespasses. And some churches and translations say debtors, right? We say trespasses. We don't say sins, we say trespasses, which can mean either, being on property you're not welcome on, or doing something against someone else they don't want you to do. It's really the same thing, though. It's about crossing boundaries. Trespassing is when you cross someone else's boundary without their permission. And while we don't want to be habitual boundary crossers or deal with habitual boundary crossers, boundary crossings happen. And how we handle those matters to God. When we think about God and the Lord's Prayer, we are talking about crossing boundaries, right? We're talking about sin as crossing God's set boundaries. God said, don't do this, and we did it. God said, do this, and we didn't do it. Like, these are boundary crossings. And we cross God's boundaries. We cross other people's boundaries. And we ask God to forgive us for those trespasses, for those boundary crossings every week. Forgive us our trespasses, but that's not the end of the sentence, right? Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Thank you, David, or thank you, Jason. You win the award. Other people, I will make an actual award at some point. I really will. Other people cross our boundaries, and we are expected to forgive them. Who expects us to forgive them? God. That doesn't mean we just allow anybody to run roughshod over our lives. But it does mean we have to forgive people when they cross our boundaries and then ask God to forgive us. So when the children's pastor came over to talk to me, it went okay-ish for me. He hooked Jay up with some church swag. But when he started to, I know people don't like this word. I'm going to use a word you don't like, but there's no other word for it when a man who became a children's pastor yesterday tells a veteran female pastor how churches work. The only word is mansplain, okay? So he started mansplaining to me about church liability and property management, and I said, please stop talking. I have been a pastor for 15 years. I do not need church property liability explained to me. And even though you say now that you know how much we care for your property, that we are welcome on it, and those signs don't mean us, you did mean us. You did mean us. Or you'd have been here before they went up. I said, those signs exclude your neighbors. And there were so many other ways to approach this that would have engaged your neighbors in helping you instead of alienating us from your church. And after he left, I kept thinking about that. I was like, where did I get that? How did I get so smart? That was a smart thing to say. There are ways to say, like, hey, we have boundaries in ways that engage people instead of ways that alienate them. And I realized I learned it from Jesus, because that's what the Lord's Prayer does. It engages us in action around boundary crossing without alienating us. God is not about shutting us out when we do the wrong thing, right? And God's not about getting us to shut other people out. God is not gatekeeping and hiring us as gatekeepers. This prayer we are called to use is an invitation to engage, to both forgive and be forgiven. And it's not Jesus saying, here's a suggestion for a prayer you might use. It's pray like this. Pray then in this way. So when we say the Lord's Prayer, we are brought into active participation in forgiveness. We will forgive others who cross boundaries, and God will forgive us. That's life-changing forgiveness. And if other people are doing that too, forgiving us and being forgiven by God, this kind of engagement could be world-changing. It's almost like Jesus planned to get groups of people to do things like this, right? That's neighboring, losing the fear and engaging with others in forgiveness. We are being engaged as helpers, as neighbors, as children of God, both forgiving and forgiven. That church did not take those signs down. But a few months later, we got a new house and I moved into some other church's back lot. And y'all don't complain when I roll down your hills or a church with a preschool and a daycare. Every kid doesn't grow up in a church like my preacher's kid. I love nothing more than seeing the daycare kids walk in here on Wednesdays like they own the place, because we're teaching them that their entry is welcome, and that being in this room and singing songs and laughing and talking about God, that's not a trespass. That's a response to an invitation. We are training them to have fun and learn in this space. And like that Mother's Day Out program did for Jay, we're teaching kids they are welcome in a house of God. Now, I haven't yet seen a toddler drag their parents in and yell, "Duh!" But on Wednesday, I did have a kid making his way out, turn around and say to me, "I love you, Miss Kim." So that's a start, right? That's a start for him. I say all this to say, I know this sounds exhausting. Everything we do matters. Everything we do matters. Everything is curriculum. Everything is curriculum. Everything is a chance to live out our discipleship. Every moment of every day is a chance to choose more Jesus, to live out our discipleship. And our world really struggles to deal with when people have wronged us. And when we have wronged others, we are really bad at that right now. Like, we don't even apologize well. I cannot tell you how many people have referred other people to my apology sermon from 2 years ago because they were like, "That's a terrible apology. Here, watch a sermon on it." I had to preach a sermon about how to say I'm sorry. Okay, we've got a problem. But as disciples who realize that every choice, everything we do is a chance to live out our discipleship, we have a unique witness to a world that doesn't know how to handle wrongdoing or trespassing. And I wonder how our lives might look if we thought about sin more as trespassing. If we thought about the times people overstep our boundaries as trespasses instead of they're just jerks. Or moments when we overstep boundaries as, "Ooh, I need to be forgiven for this trespass," instead of "I'm just a jerk." What would the world look like if all of Jesus' disciples lived into this engagement God offers to forgive and be forgiven? So I have a challenge for you. Will you join me in saying the Lord's Prayer every day this week? Every day this week, being engaged by God daily in the act of forgiving and being forgiven. It takes a lot of courage, right? As much as a very brave young man who came to me at a church party and said, "I did it all." God is trying to engage us in courageous acts. Engage us in the world-altering action of forgiving and being forgiven of trespassing. Will we engage? Will we engage? Let us pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen.